Good afternoon. Welcome to Empire Justice Center's webinar today, Dating Violence and LGBTQ Youth, Recent Updates in New York's Dignity for All Students. It is Tuesday, July 10th, 2018, and we're so pleased to be bringing today to you. My name is Amy Schwartz-Wallace, and I'm a senior attorney here at the Empire Justice Center, and we're going to be moderating today's webinar and hosting the two presenters. Our two presenters for today's program include Andrew Santa Anna, and Andrew is the Director of Legal Services at Day One, which is based in New York City, and Day One partners with youth to end dating abuse through community education, supportive services, legal advocacy, and leadership development. And Andrew is a longtime provider of domestic violence-related services. We're also joined by Bobby Hodgson, who is a staff attorney at the New York Civil Liberties Union, where he works on statewide civil rights and civil liberties impact litigation. He joined NYCLU as a Skadden Fellow, focusing on LGBTQ youth issues, and he's worked extensively on advocacy related to LGBTQ students in schools. So both of the perspectives of today's presenters are going to be together to this really unique program addressing this intersectional issue on LGBTQ youth in school who are experiencing intimate partner violence and bullying. And we're going to be exploring in today's webinar some of the remedies and relief, including some of the new changes to DASA that we wanted to be sure to let folks know about that are happening in the regulatory process. So before we start the webinar, I just wanted to give you all a little bit of information about processes and procedures today. We are providing all the handouts for today's webinar, including the PowerPoint that you're seeing, under the handouts bar on the tab. So you'll see handouts 4, and that includes materials for today's program from both of our presenters, as well as the PowerPoint and an attorney affirmation form dated for today. And if you are an attorney and looking for CLE credit for today's program, you're going to want to fill that out, and you're going to want to be listening for the CLE code that I will be providing at a random time during today's program. The other thing is everybody is in listen-only mode for today's program, but in order to be able to receive and answer questions, we'll be using the questions tab. So please use the questions tab to answer any questions that you may have throughout the program. We'll be stopping periodically to take questions. So if a question arises, know that we will get to it. We may not get to it the moment you post it, but we will be looking for questions and pausing throughout. And finally, we'll be using the chat feature here and there to share information with the group as the program goes on today. But I did want to let you know that for today's webinar, the handouts and the materials are only available during the web itself. So if you want to save those materials, you're going to want to download them and save them on your own. Also, I wanted to let folks know this is not an LGBTQ cultural competency 101, and if those are some services that you are in training that you need, today's program will not, but we would invite you to take the opportunity to explore some of other Empire Justice Center's other programming and some of the other rich resources that are widely available on the internet on cultural competency issues. So with that, I'm going to turn the program over to Andrew.
Hey, thank you so much for that introduction, Amy. I'm really honored to be invited to this webinar. I think it's a timely topic, and I'm really excited to present. So with that said, I'm going to jump in, and as Amy said, if y'all have questions, please feel free to add them to the questions feature, or say hi to Matt, and hopefully we can have a really great hour together. With that said, as Amy mentioned, I work at Day One, where I'm the Director of Legal Services, and there, as Amy mentioned, we provide all different kinds of services. And so you can check out our website, which is at the bottom of the PowerPoint presentation if you have any questions about that, and my bio is there as well. And for today's webinar, here's what we're going to be going over. We're going to be talking about dating violence and LGBTQ. We're going to do an overview, and as Amy mentioned, it's not going to be an LGBTQ or an DV 101, but at the same time, we're going to hit on some of those themes. What we are going to be talking about are some of the unique challenges and vulnerabilities facing LGBTQ youth as it relates to domestic violence and dating violence. And we're going to give some examples of that. We're going to go through remedies, and as I turn it over to Bobby in a little bit, we're going to be talking about state and federal remedies and specifically DASA. So that's what's on the menu for today. And without further ado, why don't we go forward? So as I said, this is day one. And for many folks know that who've attended trainings that I've done before, I really like trying to frame the conversation. And this conversation, I think, is really timely, and I always try to use either like a work of art or some point of reference. And so just to sort of help set the tone and talk about why this issue and why the issue of working with LGBTQ youth is so important, I wanted to raise this slide. And I don't know if many of you know this, but this is from the artist David Wojnarowicz, who was sort of an early sort of artist in the 90s and 80s in New York, doing a lot of work with ACT UP, and he actually unfortunately died of AIDS in the early 90s. But he created this one work, which I will read pieces of it to you, and it says this, again, with respect to working with LGBTQ youth. It says, "One day this kid will get larger. One day this kid will come to know something that causes a sensation equivalent to the separation of the earth from its axis. One day, this kid will reach a point where he senses a division that isn't mathematical. One day, this kid will feel something stir in his heart and throat and mouth. One day, this kid will find something in his mind and body and soul that makes him hungry. One day, this kid will do something that causes men who wear the uniforms of priests and rabbis, men who inhabit certain stone buildings, to call for his death. One day, politicians will enact legislation against this kid. One day, families will give false information to their children, and each child will pass that information down generationally to their families, and that information will be designed to make existence intolerable for this kid. This kid will begin to experience all this activity in his environment, and that activity and information will compel him to commit suicide or submit to danger in hopes of being murdered or submit to silence and invisibility. Or one day, this kid will talk. When he begins to talk, men who develop a fear of this will attempt to silence him with strangling, fists, prison, suffocation, rape, intimidation, drugs, ropes, guns, laws, menace, roving gangs, bottles, knives, religion, decapitation, and immolation by fire. Doctors will pronounce this kid curable as if his brain were a virus. This kid will lose all his constitutional rights against the government's invasion of his privacy. This kid will be faced with electric drugs and gene therapies in laboratories tended by psychologists and research scientists. He will be subject to loss of home, civil rights, jobs, and all conceivable freedoms. All this will begin to happen in 1 or 2 years when he discovers he desires to place his naked body on the naked body of another boy. So I'll just take a second for that because I think it can be kind of heavy. And this was a piece of a work of art that was created in 1990, which is at this point almost 30 years old, or maybe over 30 years old. And with that context, I want us to sort of place and think about the experiences of LGBTQ youth, for whom many of these issues are still really relevant, right? And so when we talk about the challenges and particular vulnerabilities as it relates to LGBTQ youth, and particularly as it relates to dating violence, it's really about whose stories are told, whose stories get to be told, whose stories have value, and who gets to tell those stories, right? So this is an opportunity for us in this webinar to tell the stories of LGBTQ youth and some of the vulnerabilities that they face in the context of particularly of dating violence. So with that said, what I wanted to do is just a brief intro of the issue. And so I wanted to kind of like very briefly define a couple terms or just putting them out there. When we talk about dating violence, we're talking about a pattern of controlling and violent behavior in casual or serious relationships involving young people. So DV or youth DV affects people regardless of race, class, gender identity, gender expression, or sexual orientation, right? So that's sort of an umbrella term that we'll be using interchangeably. When we talk about LGBTQ, right, we're talking about lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, or questioning folks. And again, I think one of the things that I think we'll touch upon during this webinar is that those experiences, or even these terms, despite the acronyms, are not all-encompassing. Many of these terms are umbrella terms. Many of these terms are used by some people in the community and not used by others, right? So when we're talking about language that's evolving, you know, some folks say LGBTQ, IA, TS, right? So there's a lot of other terms out there. And then I actually looked up youth on Merriam-Webster, and what came up was the time of life between one is young, or the period between childhood and maturity, right? So with that said, in telling the stories of LGBTQ youth, with the background of what we saw in the previous slide with the David Wojnarowicz experience, one thing that I wanted to point out is that when we're talking about this population, right, if we're doing so genuinely with an intersectional lens, we're lifting up not only experiences of LGBTQ youth, but how they compare and contrast to heterosexual or straight youth and other communities, right? So when we talk about the communities which we serve, that they're victims or survivors or experiencing dating or domestic violence, that they're LGBTQ youth are likely important parts of their story, not the only part of their story that helps them or hinders them in choosing to decide how to determine what to do about instances of violence in their life, right? So with that said, and just heads up, I think the PowerPoint in the download might be a little bit different just because I switched up one of the slides. But what I wanted to talk about is some of the stats as it relates to LGBTQ youth and IPV. So when we talk about the instances of dating violence, these stats were taken from a study from the Urban Institute, which came out in 2013. And so a lot of my work is related to teen dating violence and technology. And to be perfectly honest, I expect that some of the cyber dating abuse or some of that violence that's taking place online is probably higher within the 5 years that that's been taking place. But according to studies, right, like 37% of LGBTQ youth report dating cyber abuse relative to 26% of heterosexual youth, right? 43% of LGBTQ youth report physical violence, 59% report psychological dating abuse, 23% report sexual coercion. And so when we're telling those stories, right, we're talking about these relatives to other folks, and that these young people are vulnerable in a bunch of different ways. And here's the thing that I want to say about that as well, because I think with respect to LGBTQ youth and vulnerability, I think the sort of flip side of that is also LGBTQ youth and resilience, right? So these spaces that young people occupy, right, whether they be schools, whether they be online spaces, they can be spaces and places of empowerment, right? So young people can find community, they can find love, they can find friendships, they can find resources online, and they can also be victimized and find violence there, right? Similarly, school can be places of support, education, empowerment, love, but they can also be spaces of isolation, violence, manipulation, bullying, etc. Right? So when we think about these stats, it's important to keep those things in context. One thing that I wanted to point out most particularly is that when we talk about LGBTQ youth, it's important for us not to sort of erase the experiences of trans and gender nonconforming youth. And as we know, not only is data often difficult, but hopefully better over time around capturing the experiences of trans youth and gender nonconforming youth. We also know that trans youth and trans youth of color are often most vulnerable to dating violence with, according to this study, 89% of youth reporting some kind of physical violence, right? So if we're thinking not only about the violence that they're experiencing from their intimate partner, but the physical, psychological, sexual, sort of cyber-based bullying and harassment they're experiencing outside of that, it can be really overwhelming. So with that said, I'm going to go to the next slide and talk about, and here's where I wanted to spend the most time actually, the barriers that LGBTQs face when seeking help. You know, at our work at Day One, we talk about how many young people actually come out about their experiences of dating violence. And one of the stories that we often tell is that 2/3 of young people, regardless of gender or sexual orientation, don't tell anyone about their experiences of dating violence. And amongst that, often people are surprised by that, but it actually isn't all that surprising for us who are actually doing the work, is that or less than 3% of those young people actually report to law enforcement or police or social workers, right? And that's often based in that deep distrust of systems. So if we're occupying that space between childhood and maturity, there's that place of growing where young people are engaging in boundary testing and lots of age-appropriate behaviors, and also have a distrust of adults as they sort of distinguish themselves from their families, from their communities, and seek to own and define their own identities, right? The other thing that I would say is that most services are not designed with LGBTQ youth in mind, right? So when we think of the story of dating violence, or we think of the story of domestic violence, how many of those involve LGBTQ youth? Like, off of my head, I can't think of any media or like movies or short films that involve LGBT youth and dating violence, right? Often, as represented by our popular culture, the stories of coming out and some of that violence is often enough, or often that's kind of what gets seen, but not with the intersection of dating violence. So if anyone has any movies that they suggest I watch, or shows that depict LGBTQ youth and dating violence, put it in the chat. I'd love to check it out. When we talk about barriers for LGBTQ youth, again, we're also talking about a fear of outing, right? What is it for someone to tell or expose someone's sexual orientation, gender identity, or if we're looking at it from an intersectional lens about their immigration status, right? In the time that I've been doing this work, those threats have been pretty significant. I remember when I first started practicing, I worked with a young man whose partner outed him on MySpace, and didn't do so explicitly. He was like, do you know so-and-so's secret? That's what he posted on his page. And that in and of itself, was terrifying for the clients that I was working with, right? And that obviously is tied very much to fear for an abusive partner, which can include not only, sort of ongoing physical violence, sexual violence, the threats of outing, or the threats of violence or retribution, not only from the partner, from their community. These things are real, right? Often if I were to do this presentation, in a large, like, sort of convention hall or in a big conference room, I'd often ask folks, I would say, how many of you have ever fallen in love, right, as a young person? And most folks sometimes tentatively raise their hands, but most folks do, right? And I think that we can't separate the experiences of youth, and LGBTQ youth in particular, with that space of simultaneously fearing retribution from an abusive partner, but also really loving them. For adolescents, for many adolescents, we're also talking about young people who are experiencing relationships and sex and affirmation, potentially, of their sexual orientation, gender expression, and identity from someone, which can be a really powerful feeling, right? I love my abusive partner. I love my boyfriend. I love my girlfriend. I love them. I just don't like when they do this. I love them and I want this to stop, but I don't want them arrested. I don't want them kicked out of school. I don't want them deported. I think often for young people and for victims of domestic and sexual violence, the fear and love go hand in hand. And I think our responsibility as service providers are often to provide people with options and let them know that we're there, and not necessarily tell them what to do, right? And I'll get to some of that a little bit later. The other thing that I would say that I really want to point out again, and this is a whole afternoon or a whole day training, is the lack of victim abuser screening and assessment, right? So when we're talking about specifically working with LGBTQ folks, it's often important for us to distinguish between what is a healthy relationship, what is an unhealthy relationship, what is a high conflict relationship, and what is an abusive relationship, right? Whose life is getting smaller, how is that pattern of power and control playing out in the relationship? And there are plenty of resources, and if you have any questions about that, that's something that I feel really strongly about with respect to serving LGBTQ clients, because often perceptions of victims and abusers are often based in sort of heteronormative gender roles. And I think often some folks get tricked into perceiving that the person that presents as butch is, or more masked, for example, is the abuser, and the person who presents as quote unquote femme is the victim. And the story is actually a lot more complicated. As anyone who's worked with victims of domestic violence or survivors of violence know, power and control can play out in many ways, including the manipulation of those without power, right? The other thing that I would say, barriers for LGBTQ youth in particular, are around sex shaming. And when I say that, right, there's that curious space that adolescents face around their curiosity around sex. And unfortunately, as indicated by the slide with David Wojnarowicz, like that curiosity is shamed. That's the ability of a young person to be able to talk about things that they are curious about, things that they want to explore, right? Potentially with another person, potentially with a person of the same sex or gender or different sex or gender, and have that conversation to open up that for the first time, and then simultaneously have that at some point be the subject of violence. And then what is it to be able to, right? I can't imagine what it takes for a young queer person to talk about their experience of being out, and then talk about their experience of violence, and then talk to a police officer about it, and then write it in a petition and talk to a lawyer and then a judge about it, or a teacher, or a social worker, or even like if we talked about like, oh, there's that coach that I really trust. What is it for someone to be able to tell that story without feeling shame or judgment, right? So that's, of course, related to fear of getting in trouble with parents or others, and that sort of stigma. And then I think when we talk about pressure from family, friends, or community, I think we're talking about, I think in this context, the tension, of course, between loving your family and community and maybe knowing that you can't be out to them, knowing that you love your folks, and they might hold some views around LGBTQ people that you don't agree with, knowing that you might love your religious community and you seek to them as a pillar of support, and this is a piece of you that you might not be willing to share, or you're not ready to share. Or simultaneously, like if you have an amazing family and an amazing community, or amazing friends, and you're dating this really popular, cool person, and what is it to like put that out there and say, you know, they're great, but you don't know what it's like when we're alone. Like there's things that you don't see. Or, you know, I think often with LGBTQ, or I would just say this for youth or even adults, like, hey, some people are attracted to really attractive partners, right? Or like popular people, or people who have lots of charisma. There are no shortage of people who are, in my experience, who are very charismatic and are abusive people. People who can get what they want, people who can charm other people, and they're that way in public and maybe not that way in private, right? I think when we're talking, the next slide is going to talk about some of sort of the risk factors as it relates to LGBTQ, but I don't want to, gloss over the fear of isolation or being alone and what that means for an LGBTQ youth or young person, right? And what does that mean in a context-specific way? What does that mean in Brooklyn? What does that mean in Staten Island? What does it mean in Albany? What does it mean in Schenectady? What does it mean in Binghamton, right? What does it mean to be alone and to have somebody that you care about whose actions don't really indicate that they care about you, right? When we talk about services not designed with LGBTQ youth, I'm often talking about the substitution of adult wisdom without youth input or empowerment. This most particularly plays out in the context of cyber abuse and harassment, right? So a few generations ago, people would say, why don't you just leave that relationship? Stop talking to him, stop talking to them, stop talking to her, right? Or why don't you just leave, right? So when we talk about some adult wisdom for youth input, it's the erasure or silencing that sometimes young people and queer people want to stay in their communities. Sometimes they want to stay online. Sometimes they want to continue to use Instagram and Snapchat and Facebook because you know what? It's fun. And you can learn things, and there's resources, and there's stories about their lives that they want to share online. When we talk about substituting adult wisdom, I think we're talking about that. Not only saying like what adults should be doing and, sort of appropriately recognizing the risks and challenges and dangers and helping a young person navigate that, but also letting that young person put their input in, right? Because again, if less than 3% of young people are actually cutting into the dating violence, I think the last thing many of them want to hear is that you should just be doing this, right? Or blaming them for using the technologies that often many of them as native users of that technology would use pretty regularly, right? If we're talking about an intersectional lens, right? What is the fear of arrest for themselves or their partners? This goes back to victim and abuser screening. This goes back to, who presents as butch or masculine. This also goes back to the context that's particularly in this climate when young people can be policed for going to the pool, for delivering a pizza, right? For walking around their neighborhood, right? What does it mean to invite other systems into that life, into those stories? I was working with a young person whose abusive partner introduced them to smoking marijuana. And the abusive partner would say, well, if you leave me, I'm going to tell the police that you smoke pot, or I'm going to tell your parents that you smoke pot, right? Or that you have that in your house, right? So when we talk about young people and LGBTQ folks in particular fearing arrest, it might be related to the violence they experience. It might be relative to like age appropriate or, if complicated behaviors around self-medication that they're doing, those barriers and vulnerabilities are real, right? I also want to just mention that small and overlapping communities, when we talk about LGBTQ youth in particular, right, where everybody knows everybody, right? Everybody in the neighborhood knows everybody. They know your business. They can hear you from their window. There are walls. There are siblings and cousins and aunties and uncles that talk. And of course, we talked about the intersection of oppressions, right? So this is a story. The story of LGBTQ youth is not only one of sexual orientation and gender identity. It is one of race. It is one of immigration status. It is one of poverty. It is one of education. It is one class, right? And so just the other thing that I would say, and again, this sort of harkens back to the time that I work with LGBTQ youth, actually any youth, in collecting evidence, right? So what happens when this evidence is online? What happens when you relate a race, a message? What happens when the most threatening texts have disappeared? What happens when after you receive a harassing message, you just erase it? Or what happens if sometimes those the physical links aren't visible, if they're below the surface? What if there are pinches that go away? Or what if the violence is sexual in nature and remote in time and it's hard to talk about, right? So I think many of these barriers are things that are parallel to the experiences of, sort of adult survivors or, other dating violence survivors. But I think in the context of LGBTQ youth, with those particular vulnerabilities, those are serious issues, right? And with that said, these are some pretty sobering risk factors as it relates to LGBTQ youth, right? LGBTQ youth are 3 times more likely to consider suicide than heterosexual youth, right? This is from a CDC study, right? They're 4.5 times more likely to attempt suicide than heterosexual youth. And they're 4.5 times more likely to make a suicide attempt resulting in injury, poisoning, overdose that has to be treated by a doctor. So what if you combine those things? You combine the space of isolation, you combine that space of violence, you combine that space where someone might not be able to talk to someone in their family about that with these sort of risk factors. How does that add up, right? So maybe for some folks, these stats are surprising, and maybe they're not for folks, right? There is the 4th bullet, 34% of LGBT youth reported being bullied on school property. And so I think that is a nice segue into the work Bobby's gonna be talking about in a little bit, right? And, as it also says that they're more likely to experience homelessness, and they're more likely to be targets of hate crimes. And so when we talk about LGBT youth in dating violence, it's important to connect not only those experiences of things that happen sort of IRL in real life. Some of those things that happen outside of school continue into school, right? Because of the presence of cell phones, because of the presence of rumors, because of the presence of notes, because young people will share spaces and talk, as would anyone, right? So those factors are pretty significant for LGBTQ youth. And as I hand this over to Bobby in a moment, I just want to give you a couple examples of how this plays out. And these are sort of composites of things that we've worked on at Day One and through my experience as an attorney, right? Emotional abuse, right? So, for example, David is a high school senior, and on a few occasions his boyfriend has sexually exceeded what he's comfortable with. And his boyfriend threatens that he will out him and post intimate images and videos of them online if ever he cheats or leaves him. So as I went back, right, let's talk about those risk factors. So let's bring back that mix of love and fear, of sex shaming, of fear of family and community, right, or physical abuse. Although they had been dating exclusively for 6 months, Shauna's partner, another high school student, is deeply suspicious of her. When they walk through the hallways at school together, her partner pinches her on her side, leaving marks on her body. Sometimes when they're alone, like in a school stairwell or in Shauna's apartment building, the violence is worse. Her partner slaps her and threatens if she leaves her, she will get jumped, right? So we're bridging not only the violence she experiences from her partner, but the violence potentially by her community, whether it be from the walk to the subway to within the school building herself, right? And then finally, after they broke up, Dee's ex-partner's friends continued to taunt Dee, claiming that they are a thought, and they use other racist and sexist terms to refer to them. Outside of class, Dee's partner and friends create fake profiles of Dee and falsely claim that Dee spread sexually transmitted infections. Dee is not out to everyone, but they identify as gender fluid, and Dee fears their ex-partner will continue to spread lies about that, right? So as I sort of hand it over to Bobby, I just want to keep that in mind, right? So these experiences all speak to why this is so hard, why LGBTQ youth don't report, and why, again, by the end of this, it's not surprising only 3% do. So with that, I am going to present it to Bobby. And again, I didn't see too many questions, but if y'all, we're going to have some time at the end. So please feel free to chime in then. Thank you.
So while this is all getting turned over to Bobby, this is Amy from Empire Justice Center again. I'm going to give everybody the CLE code now. And the CLE code for today's program is 71018 DASA, D-A-S-A. So again, it's 71018 DASA, D-A-S-A. All right. And again, I'll remind everybody, the handouts are available only during the program. You have about 27 minutes left to download those handouts for the program today. And again, if you have any questions, please put your questions in the question tab, and we will be taking them as the program continues. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bobby.
Great, thanks so much, and thank you, Andrew. So as Andrew said, we're now going to turn a little bit to the types of protections that exist for students in schools when some of those scenarios play out that Andrew was discussing. When we're talking about harassment and bullying flowing from someone being outed, for example, from different types of discrimination that LGBTQ students in particular, face at school. What are the protections they have? What are schools' responsibilities? And what can we as advocates, as lawyers, as people working on behalf of these students do to empower them and also to achieve some positive results for them? So this is going to be a pretty quick survey of the protections that exist from the federal to the state, with a particular focus at the end on some of the developments that have recently occurred in the world of the Dignity for All Students Act, which is New York State's law prohibiting, among other things, discrimination and harassment in school on the basis of a number of categories, including sexual orientation and gender identity. But to start with, what are we talking about when we're talking about some of these common issues LGBTQ students in schools? that are redressable through these anti-discrimination laws, right? So there is obviously straight up discrimination when a policy or a practice is affecting a student and discriminates against them on the basis of a protected category. There's also, we're talking about harassment, we're talking about a hostile environment, we're talking about school pushout that students can experience, and these problems go unaddressed when students are bullying them, etc. Also, we're not going to focus as much on them, but it's worth noting there are obviously protections related to speech and expression that come from the Constitution and other laws related to things that might affect an LGBTQ student in particular. Their ability to start a GSA or another LGBTQ club or group, attending a prom with a partner of their choosing, not having a dress code apply to them in a way that is discriminatory, etc. And of course, more general problems with a lack of understanding or invisibility in school, or a lack of an affirming or affirmative culture, or an inclusive curriculum. In particular, there are some issues that affect trans and gender nonconforming students, most of all, and in specific ways that the law is continuing to develop on, but protections exist that we'll discuss in a little bit of detail. So, if we're playing out one of the scenarios that Andrew talked about, a student's partner has outed them at school as trans or as gender fluid or as gender nonconforming, some of the things that play out when a student is at school and wants to be respected and wants their gender identity to be respected, the types of discrimination they can face from the school administration or from other students or staff will focus around potentially the use of names and pronouns, obviously, the access to sex-segregated facilities, both in the context of having access to a private or a gender-neutral option, and also access to a communal facility that is consistent with someone's gender identity. We're talking about, the boys' locker room, the girls' locker room, the bathrooms, etc. In addition, we talk about responsibilities to update records to reflect a person's gender, if they've socially transitioned, if they've transitioned at school and want their records to reflect that, want their records to reflect their name. Students have a right to have their preferred name and pronouns on their records. We also talk about privacy and confidentiality. If a school becomes aware of a student's transgender status, for example, or their sexual orientation, but that student does not want that information to become public knowledge, there are certainly privacy protections that exist that would prevent the school from informing other students, from teachers, or from parents potentially. As I said, we also talk about dress codes and gender policing, and we talk about participating in sex-segregated activities in a manner that's consistent with that student's gender identity. So those are some issues that will affect a trans and gender nonconforming student in particular in school. So,
hey, Bobby,
yeah.
Can I interject real quick? One of the participants in the program wanted to know if we would be able to focus in on one slide at a time, as opposed to having the next slide appear on the screen. I don't know if tech-wise you can do that, but I just wanted to make that request known. They may be having some trouble reading it.
Yes, I apologize. I thought this slide was taking up the entire screen, so I'm not seeing what you all are seeing, but I'm going to try and address this right now.
Okay.
And I don't know if our tech assistant is on the line as well. I do apologize that I don't have the facility with this particular program to potentially make that happen unless someone has some advice for me.
I wish I did. I don't. But let's power through, and I'll just say to the listeners, you can absolutely download the PowerPoint. So please do your best to take notes, during the program, and you'll have the full screen version of this with the handouts. So, Bobby, I apologize for interrupting. I didn't know if it was a quick fix or not.
No, I apologize for not quite being able to fix that, and I am sorry for folks, but obviously if there are any specific questions, the entire slideshow and the entire PowerPoint presentation is available for folks to download and review after. You can also reach out to me if you have any specific questions about what we're talking about.
Thanks.
So, and if at any point someone has an answer to that question, please feel free to interject again. Okay, so talking about enforcement options, when we come in as advocates and want to help the situation or help a student, or at least let them know what their rights are in school, what are we talking about potentially doing? Obviously, there's litigation. That's not a first option for many students, but it is ultimately available. We talk about litigating under federal protections that we're going to discuss in a little bit of detail. Title IX, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex, among other things, which does apply to discrimination on the basis of gender identity and expression, and as some courts of appeals have acknowledged, sexual orientation. We're talking about constitutional anti-discrimination principles. To a lesser extent, we potentially are talking about ADA claims or IDEA claims. Under state law, we're talking about litigating under the Constitution in New York State, and under the Dignity for All Students Act, which we're going to talk about in a little more detail. And it's worth noting there is also a state civil rights law, little used, but it is there and it applies to schools. And it is another enforceable law that one can bring a lawsuit under, which is not necessarily the case for the Dignity for All Students Act. So that's why it's important to know about that. More frequently, we're talking about administrative action, potentially filing a complaint, right? So historically, we have brought a lot of Office of Civil Rights complaints to the Federal Department of Education. This is DOE OCR. I will note that is not anything I would recommend anybody doing under the current administration and with the current Department of Education. We'll talk in a few minutes just about the history of some really helpful policy guidance that came out back during the Obama administration from the Department of Education regarding the protections that LGBTQ students had in schools that has since been rescinded by the Trump administration's DOE and is not being enforced at the administrative level, but which is helpful because it outlines some of the things that we continue to argue the law requires. More locally, you can bring administrative complaints in New York State. For folks in New York City, there are local options that exist that are quite robust, bringing complaints to the City Department of Education. But on a statewide level, you can bring an appeal to the Education Commissioner. It's called a 310 appeal after the Section 310 of the Education Law. You can file a complaint with the State Attorney General's office that they can investigate. And then, of course, there's policy advocacy. When we talk about a lot of advocacy will not end in litigation or even a formal complaint being filed. Rather, it might end with a helpful point to statewide guidance, to local guidance, or to model policies that exist. So the types of protections that exist legally, it's helpful to go through some of the federal protections because they are parallel to and often consistent with some of the state protections that exist, or they undergird some of the reasoning that the New York State Education Department has given for the guidance it has issued regarding the rights of LGBTQ students in schools. So, I will focus in on the Dignity Act, DASA in New York State later, but it's worth understanding that a lot of the protections that our Attorney General finds that students have, that our state education department finds students have, a lot of it is coming from federal courts interpreting federal laws or the Constitution in a parallel manner to the protections that our state statutes provide or our state constitution. So we're mostly talking here about federal Title IX's prohibition on discrimination because of sex. And I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail on that in the next slide. I just wanted to flag for folks, obviously there are other federal protections that come into play depending on the issue that you're trying to address that a student might be facing. When we're talking about privacy, FERPA, the Educational Records Privacy Act, is a useful and can be a useful tool to prevent schools from sharing information with teachers potentially, with other students certainly, or with making private information and private educational records public. We also talk about constitutional privacy protections that students enjoy. There are courts in the Second Circuit that have noted that people do have a right to privacy and confidentiality regarding their transgender status. There are also potentially ADA claims, IDEA claims that might be relevant to some of the students we're talking about. But for now, we're really focusing on Title IX, discrimination because of sex, because a lot of the problems we want to address ultimately are forms of discrimination or forms of a hostile environment that rises to the level of prohibited discrimination because of a person's sex. Now, the phrase, obviously, because of sex, might not intuitively be understood to cover discrimination on the basis of gender identity expression or sexual orientation. But in fact, over many decades of interpreting that law, courts have found that it does, in fact, cover certainly discrimination on the basis of gender identity expression, and in some cases, including in the Second Circuit currently, sexual orientation. This is because of a case called Price Waterhouse versus Hopkins. It's in your CLE materials that the Supreme Court decided in 1989, and its progeny, of course, a series of cases around the country. Basically, we could go into a whole hour talking about this line of doctrine, but what it establishes is that discrimination on the basis of sex, which is prohibited by Title IX and the Constitution, isn't limited to what courts once thought it was, and in fact strikes at the entire spectrum of sex-based stereotyping and discrimination that is based on a person's failure to conform with society's stereotypes about their gender, about their sex. So over a series of many years, it's been pretty well established that when we're talking about transgender and gender nonconforming students being discriminated against, they are clearly being discriminated against because of sex in a way that that violates Title IX. There were a series of complaints brought to the Department of Education that established this in the context of transgender students. Some of them are in your CLE materials, and there are a series of cases that have established this in courts of appeal. So there is a guidance letter in your CLE materials. As I said, it's no longer in effect. It has been rescinded by the Trump administration, but it's helpful in that it outlines all the ways in which some common problems that face trans and gender nonconforming students in schools and LGBT students in general are forms of prohibited discrimination under these federal laws and principles. It talks about having a right to a safe and non-discriminatory environment to be free from bullying that is based on these protected characteristics. It talks about students' rights to have ID documents that reflect their names and pronouns and genders, to have their preferred names and pronouns used, that it is a form of discrimination to willfully, intentionally, or routinely refuse to use a person's preferred names and pronouns. That is a form of discrimination to deny them access to sex-segregated activities and facilities that are consistent with their gender identity. And that it is a form of discrimination to out them, for example, or to not respect the privacy of their status if that is something that they wish to keep confidential. So that is sort of a guide for all the versions of discrimination that we frequently see and that are prohibited not just by federal law, but as we'll get to it, by state anti-discrimination laws as well in a more explicit way. As I said, other federal protections exist in the context of privacy when we're talking about FERPA. The constitutional privacy right that we locate comes from a Second Circuit case from 1999 called Powell versus Shriver that discusses and acknowledges the constitutional right to privacy in one's own transgender status. The ADA is an interesting law where there is a lot sort of developing that folks should be aware of. There is written into the Americans with Disabilities Act protections seemingly an exclusion for that stating that it does not cover discrimination on the basis of gender identity disorder, which was the phrase used at the time. That has been the subject of some litigation arguing that, in fact, that exclusion is either unconstitutional or the statute can be read in a manner to protect people on the basis of their gender dysphoria diagnosis and discrimination that flows from it. So it's interesting and worth noting that and considering it. The IDEA, of course, in the context of the rights of students in schools, can come into play when not only when there's sort of an intersectional issue with a student, but also when we're talking about bullying based on a recognized disability, for example, and a student's right to a free public education. But moving on from there and looking more specifically in these last few minutes at state and local protections and the Dignity Act in particular, because it is so central to the protections that exist in New York State, this is the Dignity for All Students Act. It was passed in 2010, implemented in 2012. It amended the education law, and of note to what we're discussing today, it is unique in New York State law because it created explicit protections based on both sexual orientation and gender identity and expression. So it prohibits, among other things, discrimination and harassment on the basis of those categories explicitly. Obviously, a lot of the work we were doing in the federal context was just getting to that threshold question of sex discrimination covers people when they are discriminated against on these bases. With the state law, there's no work that needs to be done. It is written explicitly into the statute, and those protections exist. So that is one of the highlights of DASA. That is one of the unique things about it, and it is a great thing. In addition, DASA sort of goes beyond a lot of other similar civil rights laws in that it creates affirmative obligations on schools to go through trainings, to appoint a DASA coordinator, who is a person in a school who is tasked with receiving complaints from students regarding any violations of DASA. There are reporting requirements that require schools to collect any incidents of bias or harassment or bullying based on the categories that are listed in the law. And there's an affirmative obligation to avoid a hostile environment. So these are the types of requirements that we can often turn to when a student is experiencing problems in school and the school is not responding well. We can say, you are violating DASA, you are not fulfilling your obligations under the law. And there's a lot of good language in the statute and in the implementing regulations that talks about what schools need to do. I will highlight at this point, just because it's worth noting for the litigators out there, DASA does not include an explicitly written private right of action, which means that courts up to the appellate level in New York State have held that you cannot bring a private suit against a school alleging DASA violations. It's a law that exists without an enforcement mechanism in the courts for some students pursuant to that interpretation that currently exists at the appellate level. Complaints of violations have to be brought to the educationer in the form of what I described earlier as the 310 appeal, or to the school directly and say, you're violating DASA, you do something about it. We do run into the problem of the school saying, well, sue me, you can't. So this is an issue that's working its way, obviously, through litigation, through advocacy avenues, and is a problem with DASA, the lack of a private right of action. That said, alerting the state attorney general's office of DASA violations and alerting the state commissioner on education are two options available that folks should think about pursuing. And I'd be happy to talk with you directly if you're considering that for any of your clients or anyone you come across. Examples of local versions of similar laws and protections include the New York City Chancellor's Regulation, which creates sort of parallel protections. As I noted before, there are state constitutional rights, and there is a state civil rights law that prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex. And under the same theories that we discussed earlier, sex discrimination certainly applies to discrimination on the basis of gender identity and expression. And so that's an option. There is a private right of action in the state civil rights law, and so that can be enforced through the courts if all else fails. I'm also noting that our state human rights law, which is the sort of general go-to civil rights anti-discrimination law across the state, has been interpreted by our Court of Appeals not to apply to public schools, which is a huge problem. It needs to be fixed legislatively, but that is part of why we're not talking about bringing human rights law complaints in the state. There is helpful guidance that was released by the New York State Education Department, particularly focused on the rights of trans and gender nonconforming students in schools. It tracks a lot of the protections I discussed earlier that the federal DOE had released in its guidance under the Obama administration. It talks about schools' obligation to create a safe and non-discriminatory environment, avoid harassment and bullying, and address that. It talks about a school's requirement to respect students' names and pronouns and to change ID documents whenever possible. It talks about schools having the requirement to allow students to access sex-segregated activities and facilities consistent with their gender identity, and it talks about privacy. If you look at this policy, you will notice that it is a little outdated in that it quotes and refers to a lot of federal guidance and federal positions that are no longer valid. But it does exist. It is a helpful document, and it's a tool in your toolkit to advocate on behalf of your clients and students. The New York City Department of Education policy is a little bit more robust, a little bit more specific, a little bit more up to date, and includes a lot of other much more specific requirements and opportunities to enforce those protections. The thing that we're going to focus on last, as we sort of come to a close, and then hopefully leave a minute or two for questions, is the fact that the state education department has now implemented and proposed at the same time a set of regulations that make more robust these protections under the Dignity for All Students Act. What they do, and as I said, these were both introduced for notice and comment and also implemented on an emergency basis by the state education department just a few months ago. These are regulations that amend the reporting requirements under DASA to include specific examples of the type of harassment or discrimination that is prohibited under the law. So this is the only place where we sort of like break out in specifics in enforceable regulations some of the interpretations that I just talked about. Because DASA, of course, the language of the statute is much more general and just prohibits discrimination and harassment on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity, among other things. These regulations go into some specifics and talk about, in the context of the reporting requirement, how examples of that discrimination includes the denial of access to school facilities that are consistent with one's gender identity, the application of a dress code in a way that that discriminates on the basis of gender identity and expression, misuse of names and pronouns, and other forms of harassment and bullying based on, among other things, sexual orientation and gender identity. So those regulations are really exciting. There's something, again, yet another tool in our toolkit to point to when we are advocating on behalf of students. And they also impose this requirement that schools collect and report on this data so that hopefully we can do even more in the future to address these problems. I would be eager to talk to anyone interested in putting together comments because that comment period is still open through the end of July, at least, I believe. Regarding these regs, I think they're way stronger and more specific that I would be happy to talk through offline. That's the end of my presentation. I know we have just a couple minutes, but I wanted to throw it open to our moderator and to anybody who has additional questions.
Thank you, Bobby. So I just wanted to, again, ask our listeners to use the question feature to pose any questions. We did have one question come in. Ryan, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, so when it comes to other sorts of commissioner's appeals, like appealing a suspension or something of that nature, it's typically exhaustive in that you need to go first to the hearing itself, then to the local board of education, then finally to the commissioner. Has it been tried, or is there guidance as to whether that applies to filing a DASA complaint directly to the commissioner? Is there an exhaustive process prior, or can you go straight there?
It has not been tried. There is very little guidance. I think you've pointed out a current weakness of the system. Again, the fact that DASA doesn't have a private right of action is a problem, is that ostensibly these things are available. There is not a clear process that has been articulated by the state commissioner on how these complaints are supposed to be brought to them. I would argue that you do not need any sort of lower hearing because none exists beyond a final determination by the school district on some issue that has been resolved in an unsatisfactory way. You're appealing that determination And when nothing exists beyond a school, for example, saying the student can't have a bathroom, or we're not going to do that, or if a school has failed to address harassment or bullying, I would argue that you can go directly to the commissioner with an appeal. That said, it has not been established, and there are no published policies or guidance for making those complaints that I'm aware of.
Thanks, Bobby. Question just came in. Let me get that. Okay. Question is, what rights do trans students have in school per names and pronouns? Do both parents have to approve of the name change in school if the youth is under 18?
So, as I said, this is something where it's all coming under the sort of umbrella of what is a form of discrimination and what is prohibited. So it has been established through court cases and through guidance that using, refusing to use a person's preferred pronouns or their preferred name is a form of discrimination that's prohibited. That should apply to everyone regardless of their age and regardless of their parent's position on that, right? A parent doesn't have the authority to tell a school to discriminate against their child in any other context, so they certainly don't have the authority to tell a school to discriminate against their child in this context. That said, depending on the age of the child, it does come into play that schools are reluctant to, or can be reluctant to respect a child's affirmed gender identity in certain contexts if the student is very young, for example, or if the parents are opposed to that. There's no formal requirement that you don't need two parents to sign off on any request like that. A school should, by default, be respecting a student's pronouns and respecting their name. In certain contexts, if you haven't been able to obtain a legal name change through the courts, there are some documents that the school might not be able to fully update. But for day-to-day documents, when we're talking about attendance sheets, when we're talking about student ID cards, if those exist, or what teachers are calling students, that has no legal name change requirement, has no parental approval requirement. That said, I will say, the law seems to indicate that on a somewhat sliding basis, the closer a student is to 18, if it's a 17-year-old, a 16-year-old, and their parents are not supportive and are telling the school not to respect that student's gender identity, you have a very clear case that the school does not need to listen to the parents and does in fact have a responsibility to not discriminate against that child and to respect their names and pronouns. However, when a student is significantly younger than that, if we're talking about a sixth grader, a seventh grader, it's a bit of a legal gray area at the moment where there haven't been cases decided and where parents arguably have a much stronger constitutional right to determine their child's education and their experience in school. So it is not developed clearly in the law. I think we obviously always argue on the side of you can't be discriminating against students, and this is a form of prohibited discrimination. But schools are more reluctant to sideline a parent's views or go against them when a student is younger. It's not like a clear-cut 18-year-old line, though.
And if I can just also add to that, I think in the context of domestic violence, you may have a situation where you have an affirming and supportive parent, and you may have a parent who is not affirming and not supportive. That parent who is not affirming and not supportive may even be that parent that uses domestic violence. And so now you have a situation where you have the parents at odds, and you have concerns around safety of both the transgender child and the victimized parent, where the schools are kind of in the middle of the parents' disputes, and we've definitely been trying to assist families navigating these very dynamics. It's very challenging. With that, we're actually at and just exceeded time. So I just wanted to thank both Andrew and Bobby for today's program. It was really, really terrific. And Bobby, given that the guidance that was published, do you happen to have the date that if folks want to comment on the regulations, when those comments need to be received? I think we're still within the comment period. did we lose Bobby?
Oh, sorry, I was just on mute. I believe that I don't have the specific date. Folks should reach out directly to me or to anyone who wants to, if they're interested in comments, because I think we are able to put together a model form. I believe the date is the last week of July, but unfortunately I don't have the specific date in front of me right now.
And I apologize, neither do I. I'm not sure if it's in the materials, but it's critical for listeners to know that there's still an open comment period, and even if you are a legal services organization, you may still comment. It is a public comment period, so there are no restrictions on the ability to put in comments to this regulation. If you agree with it and feel like it's helpful, or if you want to offer some changes or suggestions on other language. So that's the great thing about a public comment period, is that they can hear from everybody. So with that, I just wanted to again thank our presenters, Andrew and Bobby, for today's program. Today's program is being recorded, so we will get it posted up on Empire Justice Center's website, hopefully soon, and feel free to share that around. So thank you, everybody, and thank you for attending today's program.